Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Julia Coakley, Head of Operations, and on behalf of the MGAA, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar this afternoon. This is being hosted by Green Kite. Before I introduce our lead host, I'd like to run through a few housekeeping points. Please ensure that your microphone and your camera is off. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the chat button at the bottom of your screen, which the panel will be happy to answer as received. Any questions that aren't answered before the end of the presentation, Green Kite will be happy to pick those up with you post-event. The presentation is accredited for CPD points if relevant to your ongoing professional development programme. The video will be available on our website and uploaded to our YouTube channel, and Green Kite are kindly providing materials to complement this webinar. Please also take time to respond to our feedback survey, which will be issued after this webinar, as this will enable us to deliver the best quality events to our membership. So today's webinar, the post-COVID-19 workplace, ethical behaviour, respecting individual rights and new ways of working, is brought to you by Green Kite. I'd like to introduce you to Sarah Ager, CEO. Thank you, Sarah. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Julia, for that kind welcome, and thanks everyone for joining us this lunchtime. I hope you find this session informative and relaxed, and actually what we're hoping to be able to do is to give you some practical tips on what you should and shouldn't do when your employees are returning to work post-jab, and also some ideas around framing your work environment and tips for how you can ensure that your employees are happy, look after their mental well-being, and also they are as productive as possible for you. So, and it doesn't have to be mutually exclusive. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is introduce you to our two speakers today. I'll just be guiding them through the questions. We are delighted that both Paul and Christine are able to join me today on the panel. Both Paul and Christine work at Green Kite. Christine is our resident in-house general counsel, and her specialism obviously is employment and people issues. And Paul is an HRD. He's very experienced in the insurance space as well as other sectors. So they will give you a very interesting and informative tour around post-COVID workplace rules and obligations for the firm. For those of you who don't know Green Kite, we've been an MGAA supplier member now. This is our second year since our inaugural year last year. And we run the People Advisory line, which focuses on help for those of you in the space who require people and HR support. So we do run that service for you, which is one of the value adds of your membership. So please do feel free to reach out with any queries. In particular, post today's presentation, you'll find that each firm will have different needs and requirements. So please do feel free to contact either myself or Paul as the first point of contact, so we can help you with any individual queries. So firstly then, let me introduce you to Paul Leach. Paul, perhaps you'd like to just tell the audience a little bit more about yourself and some of the interesting fact about COVID-19 and what's happened to your technical space of work during that period, please.
Yes, thanks very much, Sarah, for the introduction. Well, my name is Paul Leach. I'm one of the founders at Green Kite. My areas of expertise are HR and organisational development and change in organisations. As Sarah previously alluded to, I've worked across a range of different industries. I was HR director for Arthur J. Gallagher when it went through its rapid acquisition spree, starting in 2011. Prior to that, I headed up as OD director for Spire Healthcare. I took them through a 1.44 billion acquisition and culture change. I've worked in previous consultancy organisations and for organisations such as Sainsbury's. COVID has had a dramatic shift in terms of how we work in the future. And it should never be underestimated what that's going to mean for organisations in terms of digitisation, flexible working, and indeed creating what's known as hybrid models of working, which we're going to be talking about a little bit later. And I honestly think it's probably, from an organisational shift perspective, one of the most exciting times moving forward that we've probably experienced in at least 50 years. And it's not a case of organisations just going back to work the way that they did previously. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Paul. Christine, so what's been interesting for you in this time of furlough and change of work, please?
Oh, hi. So, I mean, for me, it's interesting that you say furlough. For definitely for the last year, most of the issues that I've been dealing with have been furlough related, flexible furlough, layoffs, changing contracts, short time working, and also the moral side of this, whether employers really were utilising the furlough scheme as it was intended, whether employees who were placed on notice and were paid furlough during that period, whether that was morally correct or not. So it really has been a furlough-filled year, and especially at the beginning when it was so uncertain, and then it changed and rules, the guidance and everything was changing. So that was really exciting, unpredictable, fascinating for lawyers who, you know, are there to try and understand how things would be interpreted and so on, pretty much working in the dark. So yeah, that's what it has been, a fuel-filled furlough year, and we know that that's coming to an end. And what we're looking forward to next year as barristers, we're enthusiastically looking at is what Paul said, hybrid working, and what that's going to bring with it, and also the wealth of claims that have been piling up in the employment tribunal and how they're going to unfold and how the courts are going to interpret the actions that have been taken by employers over the last year.
Thank you, Christine. That's really interesting. Don't worry, audience, we think you've been furloughed out, so we're not going to be covering off on furlough today. In fact, Greenkite have done a couple of seminars for you already on furlough. So as we all know, COVID brought massive disruption a year ago, and the importance of physical proximity in work is now less important. We've had, I think yesterday, it was announced by the BBC that in the UK there've been over 25 million first jabs given to the population. And so what we're going to concentrate on today's seminar is two main issues that arise, and that's what the employer's responsibilities are to other employees around vaccines, but also the hybrid model, which has been touched on in the introduction by both Paul and Christine. So as I say, let's move on if we can to vaccines, both Christine and Paul, if that's all right. I mean, definitely for the UK, vaccines have been lauded up as the way out of the COVID issue and the pandemic generally. And there's been lots of hype in the press recently, hasn't there, about you know, vaccines, whether or not people should be made to have them. Can you make people have them? And obviously some countries in Europe are definitely what they're now deeming anti-vax. I mean, we didn't know what an anti-vax country was until a couple of weeks ago, but now it seems that we all do know. And in the UK, it seems that probably most employers are likely to opt to encourage employees to take up the vaccine without mandating it. But I really wondered whether or not, Christine, it is possible legally for an employer, so an employer firm, to force or require their employees to be vaccinated, and or what are the ethical considerations of a firm imposing such a requirement on their workforce. Is that okay? Do you think you could answer that for the audience? I'm sure this is a hot topic for all of them.
Well, I'll give it my best shot.
Thank you very much.
So it's a really interesting question. I'm sure everybody's heard about Pimlico plumbers, no jab, no job. and people have heard about various other headlines, which is not to do with the jab, but, you know, lorry driver wasn't unfairly dismissed when he refused to wear his mask, and headlines such as those give employers a false sense really of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, failing to realise that every case is dealt with on its particular facts, and none of these cases have gone to the higher courts as yet. So in terms of the legal implications of mandating vaccinations to your workforce, I think that question needs to be split into two. First of all, we talk about existing employees, and then we talk about potential employees. So the first question, if you don't mind me rephrasing your question, my first question would be, can an employer impose vaccinations on their existing workforce? And the simple answer to that would be no, because it would have to be a contractual term. And in order to make it mandatory, there would have to be a change to the contract, for which the employer would need to consent. And there's various other ways in which an employer can seek to impose a variation to a contract.
So could I just ask you then, Christine, if the employee agrees to amendment to their contract, is that okay?
Well, if an employee agrees to a change to their contract and they know that that change is going to require them to be vaccinated, then the employer has got consent. Okay, it's all about, you know, you cannot impose something, especially something as invasive as that. And, you know, there's also Article 8 of the European Convention of Human Rights, which talks about, you know, you can't have that sort of treatment, you can't have that kind of physical or psychological treatment imposed on you. So, yes, you need the consent of the employee. If you get the consent, not a problem. Okay, if you don't have that consent, and it's unlikely that that will be in any contract of employment at this point. Okay, so that's a really simple answer. And also ACAS actually advises against trying to impose that. Now, there's a separate question when we come to a requirement. So if an employer puts an advert out and stipulates as a requirement that the employee needs to be vaccinated, then of course the prospective employee has an option as to whether they want to go for that job or not. Now, there are legal implications surrounding such a requirement, their potential discriminatory implications and health and safety, which may go into discriminatory implications. So at the moment, because neither Public Health England nor the government have mandated for compulsory vaccinations, I would say no, it's not possible for an employer to unilaterally require an existing employee to be vaccinated. Now there's the moral side of it, and I know there's information there. Polls have been carried out. I think Glassdoor did a poll in November last year, and that found that 56% of employees said that they would be reluctant to return to work unless they were sure that everybody in the workplace had been vaccinated. And what was more important was that 14% said that they would resign if the entire workforce were not vaccinated. So we know there is a real concern about, you know, employees' safety and returning to work. Similarly, we have 23% of employers who said that they planned to require their staff to be vaccinated. Now, that might be prospective staff. If it's existing staff, as I've said, there's going to be a lot of legal arguments surrounding the legality, the justification and so on of that. If it were to go ahead, it could lead to, you know, claims of breach of contract, constructive dismissal, all sorts of claims which I'll be delighted to receive and to go and hear them in the tribunal. So I think legally, if it's a potential employee, yes, it's possible. Existing employees, no, it can't be forced on them. With the statistics that I've just given you, we can see that there is a bit of a moral dilemma here. We've got employees who are fearful for their own safety, who feel, maybe it's just psychological, that if everybody in the workforce was vaccinated, that would afford them a greater degree of protection. Now we know that the scientists haven't said that that is the case. We don't know what the level of transmission is, even if you've received the vaccination. So my advice would be for employers to just continue practicing the measures according to Public Health England and according to the government guidelines, because even if you have the vaccination, you should still be social distancing, you should still be sanitising your hands and wearing a face mask. So I hope that answers the question. I hope it doesn't sound as though it's a cop-out. It really, at the moment, it really is a simple question. Existing employees, no. Potential employees, possibly yes.
Thank you, Christine. So, I think what we can take from that is it is a changing area and we can't say definitively. And Paul, practically, it seems to me that Christine's saying with the current employees, you can't really impose a change on their contract, although technically they could consent to a change. UCAS is saying don't try and get them to consent to having a vaccine. And then for new employees, although you can technically advertise that you would require them to be vaccinated, then it's probably unethical to do so. So firms should be implementing and continuing to implement social distancing rules within the office to make it safe. Is that what we're saying, Paul?
It is, and I just want to pick up on what Christine was saying, because a lot of this is untested areas of the law at the moment. It really is, just one way or the other. I think even if you were to put contractual clauses in to request that somebody does have a jab before they're employed, it doesn't mean to say that they can't change their mind, because we have a right to do what we want to do with our own body, and trying to enforce somebody to participate in a vaccination, A, could amount to assault. Secondly, when employers, as Christine alluded to, attempt to unilaterally change individuals' contracts, that can give rise to breach of contract claims, which automatically can mean that covenants fall away. So that there is a huge risk in that. There are also potential risks in terms of the discrimination piece. Some of this is untested yet again. So give an example, if a female says, I'm not having the jab because it's not been out long enough and I fear that it may impact my fertility, there is indication there that could amount to sex discrimination. So it's an interesting area, and I think it all comes down to this concept of reasonableness. People are fearful.
So Paul, let me ask you then. So what does an employer do if one employee, for instance, has been vaccinated and doesn't want to work alongside, or suggests that they don't want to work alongside another employee who perhaps doesn't want to have the vaccine for their own reasons? Is there anything an employer can do to, apart from making the workspace safe, to encourage those employees back to work, to make them feel more comfortable? Do we have any practical tips, either Christine or Paul, on how we might be able to encourage those people back? Christine, maybe I can come to you.
Yeah, first of all, again, I'm not dodging the question, but I think, this is very, very sensitive data. Vaccination of employees, this is personal data, okay? So there's very, very, very strict rules surrounding that type of data. And I would be very, very concerned if employees knew who had been vaccinated and who hadn't been vaccinated. There's, GDPR breaches and also just a general breach of confidentiality. And again, what Paul was saying, this could result in an employee resigning and claiming constructive dismissal, okay? But assuming one colleague says to another one, I haven't had the vaccination, I don't believe in vaccinations or whatever. So the colleague comes into to that knowledge legitimately because it's the information has been given to them voluntarily. Okay, so the employer, I would say the employer should listen to those concerns. Okay, try and get a proper understanding, deal with the concerns under the correct procedure, process, which will be a grievance policy, perhaps. get them in, get them to understand what their concerns are, speak to them, and obviously, you know, if the employer is satisfied that they have provided a COVID safe place of work, they are complying with Public Health England and the UK guidelines, and that therefore there is no real justifiable reason for the other person's concern, then they will have to let them know that the concerns have not been upheld. If the employee continues to refuse or escalates it and says, well, I'm not then coming to work because I don't feel safe, then we've got, you know, potentially we've got the issue of whether their feeling of not being safe is covered under health and safety, and whether if action is taken against them, you know, to their detriment, whether their pay is withheld, or let's say even worse, they're dismissed for refusing to come to work. We're on dodgy grounds, but that doesn't help an employer and employers that are listening to this, because they may want to know what action they can take. So my advice in that situation would be listen to their concerns, reassure them in any way that's possible, and then require them to come into work. I mean, that reassurance you would have found out about, you know, whether they're living with somebody who's vulnerable, whether they've got an underlying illness. And even if they have all of these, it doesn't mean that somebody else who is not vaccinated poses a greater risk to them. So it's about listening to them, taking advice, professional advice, and acting in accordance with that advice. We can't give blanket answers because every situation will be different. So what Paul was saying earlier, it's about reasonableness, demonstrating that you are taking these concerns seriously, you are addressing these concerns, and you are providing the reassurance and the guarantee that the workplace is safe because you are following the guidelines.
Thank you, Christine. Paul, do you have any other practical tips that we might want to give our members today?
Yeah, I mean, look, one of the key issues is about fear sometimes. And whilst this may seem slightly odd, if you've had people in the workplace that are happy, I don't mean forcing them, to talk about if they've had COVID, or if indeed they know of people that unfortunately have passed because of COVID, real stories actually help people, believe it or not. It's a way of bringing it to life for people that are really close to you. There are a lot of fears out there at the moment, particularly from different ethnic minorities regarding the vaccine. And it is about dispelling some of the myths that have been escalated on social media, but also understanding where people are coming from. It is new. People are bound to be fearful. And I just want to pick up on something that Christine spoke about, because I think it's a really, really important matter. More of a legal issue. Never underestimate when people assert fears about health and safety. They are protected under the Employment Rights Act. Christine, I think it's section 44, if I remember rightly. They are equally protected as whistleblowers. And therefore it shouldn't be dismissed. And just picking up on what Christine was saying earlier, treat every individual as an individual. It's not just a blanket policy. I can't emphasize that enough. It's really, really important. I mean, I've dealt with a number of cases, probably like Christine has, with whistleblowing. They are highly complex, and very often the issues could have been resolved early on.
So it seems to me that there isn't one size fits all, really. It's a changing area of law. It's something that we all need to be cognizant of. It's definitely firm specific, and it appears to be individual specific, but the employer just needs to make sure that they're acting reasonably, treating people fairly, and trying to ensure that they feel safe within their workplace. Would you think that's a good summation of where we are now, Christine?
Yeah, I mean, there are other options that an employer, you know, depending on the type of work that they carry out, other options that they could consider, such as whether their employee can continue to work from home, or whether redeployment is a possibility. You know, there are options there. And I mean, Paul introduced this webinar by talking about hybrid working, a new way of working, and not going back to the old way of working. So, you know, it's, you know, there will be employers who are insistent on employees coming back to the old way of working. And that's, I think, where the problems may rest, where they don't want to demonstrate any level of flexibility whatsoever. And then again, there will be employees who just love the idea of working from home, no travel expenses, no rush hour, stuff like that. And they really don't genuinely have a fear. But as Paul said, an employer can never conclude or you know, decide this is not a genuine concern, because the courts will definitely scrutinise whether that individual genuinely does hold those concerns. So they do really need to be dealt with very, very seriously.
Thank you. So I think that's a really good segue onto the second half of our webinar, if that's okay, and that is the concept of what a hybrid workplace might look like, because I think the two issues and items shouldn't be looked at in isolation, because one could be the solution to the other problem. So at the moment, and I was reading a McKinsey report, it's just the other day they predict that hybrid or remote working could account for up to 20 to 25% of the UK's total workforce on an ongoing basis. And in computer-based work or profession, which financial services would fall into, up to 70% of people could continue working remotely without losing effectiveness. Now, whether or not that is the best way for the employee going forward is one of the areas which we're now going to cover in the second part. You know, most people on this call probably enjoy coming or have enjoyed in the past working in the city, and there are going to be some changes as well, aren't there, to them, some cities. They predict that the largest cities will feel the greatest impact with the least amount of people coming back, and policymakers might need to consider prioritising equitable access to digital infrastructure to enable some people to work more efficiently in a hybrid manner. So Paul, firstly, I think it would be useful for the audience to understand exactly what the hybrid model means, because we've heard the term floating around, but for the likes of me and the rest of the audience, what does that mean in the field to the HR teams and the employment experts?
Sure. Thanks, Sarah. Well, firstly, hybrid models are not new. They've been around for a while. But I just want to skip back slightly before we actually get into talking about hybrid models. So prior to the pandemic, roughly 5% of the population worked from home. In April 2020, at least 50% near on of the population worked at home. Now that was driven by obviously the need to isolate because of the pandemic. It in no way indicates that it is actually the right thing for all organisations. Organisations have to look at, first of all, what do their clients need? What is their infrastructure? What is their digital capability? And can they actually, hand on heart, really say that they are absolutely ready to migrate to a hybrid model? Now, a hybrid model can mean that you have a completely remote business with some interfacing to a hub. It could mean that you set up various hubs. They don't necessarily have to be in the UK. They don't necessarily have to be anywhere near located to where the work is being done. So very typically, and some of you may have read this in the newspaper recently, there is a great demand at the moment for office space just around the M25 and not necessarily in the city. So hybrid models are interesting, but it comes back to looking at the whole organisation, which is really important. I think it's worth noting that remote working doesn't necessarily work for everyone. The concept of hybrid models, as I say, has been around for a while, and I just want to talk to you a little bit about Yahoo, because Yahoo very early on adopted the approach of remote working. Then in 2013, they found that actually it was causing some problems. It was causing problems in terms of lack of innovation in the business, teams weren't collaborating enough. So what they did then was they decided to bring people back in points in time into an office environment so that they could actually interact. And that's really, really important and should never be underestimated. There's been research done, and there's been research done by a very eminent psychiatrist actually, called Edward Halliwell, that actually found that as humans, we do actually need face-to-face communication. We do actually need to be with our teams. So when we talk about hybrid models, I think what we really need to understand is that we can have people remotely working, but they do at some point need to come into some sort of a hub to collaborate, to learn and innovate from their colleagues, because isolation isn't necessarily a good thing for everyone. And there are some statistics actually from the ONS that actually, the Ipsos Global survey that was carried out last year, and I think it's worth just talking about that. In terms of the COVID pandemic, anxiety increased by 56% for most employees in terms of job security. Stress due to changes in the work routines for 55%. Difficulty finding work-life balance was 50%. And that highlights the fact that is it working from home or living at work, which has got legal implications as well. And I'm sure Christine can talk about those. But let's assume that you decide to move to a hybrid model. I mean, there's some things that you really need to think about. Who can and who should come together in an office of some type? Why do you need the office? What's the purpose of it? How are you going to get teams to collaborate? What type of work is best suited to an office location? Or what type of work is best suited to be migrated remotely? How can you start to redesign jobs that allow that to happen? And what are the considerations for the workforce in terms of having a mixed workforce where some people work remotely, some people come into a hub? How do you define new roles, which is really, really important? And how do you adapt the office to match the work? And I think really one of the key issues is that a permanently dispensed hybrid model means time spent in the office is absolutely valuable. And just touching back on that issue of collaboration and actually getting people to work together physically, which should never be underestimated. Some of the findings of people working remotely is you get really, really tired being fixed to a screen. You can't see the whole person. Indeed, very early on in the pandemic, a number of organisations were finding out they were having more meetings. And that's quite interesting because actually being with people can mean that you might just tilt your chair and say, that's really interesting what you've said over there. I've got an input. You can't necessarily do that when you're working remotely. So people coming together actually is really, really useful. And in fact, the MIP organisation did a piece of work, and what they did, they found out, they put little lanyards on people, and they found out the number of interactions in a day was quite staggering. And it's what people pick up from one another in close proximity that actually really adds to the learning that we have at work. So I think to encapsulate that, you can have knowledge workers that sit remotely, but knowledge is not just about what you pick up from a system. It's what you pick up from interactions of humans. So
Paul, so what are some of the benefits of hybrid working then? If there are some negatives, obviously, but what in your view are some of the benefits
there's huge
that
benefits.
firms can get?
Yeah, there's huge benefits, Sarah. So I think one of the obvious benefits, it really widens your pool in terms of talent. You don't necessarily need a London-centric pool. You could stretch that to the wider UK. You can even look more internationally. I mean, we've probably all of us heard of this term now of digital nomads. You can be anywhere. And that's great. It's definitely got a benefit in terms of flexibility. We're not spending 2 or 3 hours a day traveling, which is great. It can mean that employees' hours can be staggered. So if you've got childcare or you're caring for somebody, it allows a greater quality of life. It can also mean that you could move to maybe a cheaper area, which is great. So it's got both social and economic benefits.
Well, so we do have a question from the audience, actually, Paul, on that point. So if you've, during the pandemic, moved out of London,
Yeah.
or indeed are considering moving out of London, is it possible and or can your employer reduce your salary if you are no longer living in London? And I guess this links into what used to be called London waiting, although tends to just be an increase or a higher salary rate within the M25. Maybe Christine, are you best placed, or is Paul best placed to answer this one?
I'm happy to pick this up.
Okay, okay, Paul.
Christine,
Yes, please.
please have an input. You can't just unilaterally change somebody's contract and lower their salary. I mean, that's breach of contract. What you may want to do, though, when it comes to pay round and looking at rewards, which is obviously, got huge benefits in terms of the hybrid working piece, you might take into consideration that there may be a lower reward for somebody because they're actually not, they're not incurring the costs of travel, which is, in a wider sense, one of the attractions to looking at hybrid models, because it does give you scope to look at your total reward package and design it very, very differently. So, for example, if you're hiring somebody in Glasgow, the market rates in Glasgow are different. If you're engendering more flexibility, that in its own right is a reward as well.
So Paul, if we had the same employee doing a job in London, and then we were getting a second employee to do that job in Glasgow, using your example, could you pay them different rates, or would you have to pay them the same rate even though they're located in different places?
No, different markets require different premiums. That happens. That's why businesses often relocate their operations. However, in saying that, this is given a huge opportunity to look at reward in a very, very different way. Very different way.
So what we're saying is we could have different people in an organisation working in different regions on different rates, but if you're already employed and then you leave, then they can't unilaterally reduce your salary. Is that a fair summation?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, if I can just say something, if we've got time, I mean, that's a really big issue, because if somebody is, if they're working from home and they're located, just for argument's sake, in London, and they then move somewhere else which doesn't attract London waiting, and I think the initial question was whether their salary can be reduced. I mean,
correct.
As I said, that would be a unilateral variation. It would be a breach of contract, and most likely that would amount, the person would be able to resign and claim constructive dismissal, because that does go to the heart of the contract. But there would be so many factors to consider in something like this. For example, whether the working from home was intended to be permanent, whether the employee had notified their employer of a change of address, prompting their employer maybe to call them in and have a discussion and maybe discuss whether that does have an impact on the London waiting or not, or whether the person has just decided, I'm going to work from another part of the country, whether temporarily or permanently, But you know, I mean, the long and short of it is, no, they can't just unilaterally reduce the contract, but at the same time, the employee has a duty to update their employer of their location, their address, and so on, which could raise issues. It may be that the contract says you need to live within a 5-mile radius of the place that you're working, but obviously due to the pandemic, they've then been working from home. And then if they move outside of that radius, that raises a number of other issues. So it's, you know, I know Paul's given a lot of different angles, but there are even so many more angles to a situation such as that. I think in answer to the question as well, whether somebody working in London could be paid the same as somebody in Glasgow, absolutely yes, if their employer feels as though they can justify that. You know, that is something between an employer and an employee, how much they want to pay them. But having said that, if I'm living in London and I'm on 50,000 or 60,000 and I say to my employer, I'm going to move up to Glasgow, and they say, well, then we're going to reduce your salary, I don't think that would be acceptable in any court.
Thank you. Thank you. I think so. What we're saying is the hybrid model does allow or provide the employee with some freedom around work. Presumably it has some employer benefit as well, because they can offer longer and different coverage to their customers. And I think it also, as you say, Paul, gives some structure and some sociability, some independence and flexibility. But what about, and this is a question from our audience actually, from Julia, do we think or do we predict that there will be more claims being brought by employees against their employers because they haven't set them up properly at home? And by properly, I mean providing appropriate equipment, making sure it's health and safety compliant, that they do the annual checks, all those kind of nice things. I mean, what do we think for the future, Christine? Do we think that there will be a new passage of claims coming through the courts on that?
Yeah.
Are you seeing that already?
I haven't seen it yet, although I can't remember what the statistic is. I think it wasn't that high, but I think there were a number of employees who actually had injured themselves by using ironing boards as desks. Okay, and employers may think that they can absolve themselves of responsibility, but they still have under the health and safety executive, they still have responsibilities for, you know, things like the workstation, and these obligations can easily be discharged by having supervisions, sending online updates, sort of what do you call it, when
kind of like surveys and questionnaires.
Questionnaires, but the employer is still responsible. They do have the responsibility may be joint, but certainly the employer is not absolved of responsibility for health and safety. You know, using the display unit, for, you know, they need to give guidelines and make sure they can cover themselves and say, well, you know, we have explained, or this person has said that they've done the training, which tells them that they need to take a 5-minute break in every hour. They shouldn't be on the computer for more than, you know, so many hours, and that the equipment is actually fit. So to prevent them from getting repetitive strain injury and back pain, because of course we know that employers can end up with really, really hefty personal injury claims as well. So, you know, it's not just that the employer can save lots of money on office space and so on, and that there's a greater degree of flexibility for employees. There are obligations, mutual obligations, and I think, as Paul was alluding to as well, that type of working, hybrid working and working from home, is not suitable for everybody. I mean, I would say rather than it being a requirement, it should always be a choice. And the employer shouldn't just look at productivity and how much they can save. They should look at the needs of their employee as well. Not every household, you know, some employees that are lower paid, they may have problems with internet. Who's going to pay for the internet? You know, who's going to pay for the additional?
Yeah, I mean, we work in insurance, and I wonder how many of our firms out there are paying for their employees' home insurance, or made sure that they're entitled to work at home, and in the long term it's not in breach of their mortgage. So there are a number of considerations that are more on a practical point of view that I think firms need to make sure that they have a policy on before they embark upon this, which I think is fair to say. Now, we have had another question, if that's all right. So I'd like to come to Paul, if I can, on this. It's a question from Pete in the audience, because we've touched on the fact that businesses need to, while they're embarking on a change of design, they have to relook at how what their processes are at work, and actually what skills they might need, because in the new workplace they might need different skills. And this really is a question of, when you're managing people remotely, the skill set is obviously different to a face-to-face environment. And how do management teams, senior exec, deal with that differences and bridge those gaps? And that training, I guess it's a training need to help people manage a hybrid model or remote workers, as well as they would have when they sat in the desk next to them. Paul, maybe you can give an answer to that for Pete for me, please.
Yeah, there's quite a significant development requirement. So developing leaders to lead remote workforces is quite a substantial change. You know, I read something recently that said remote working is not for lazy leaders, because the amount of time that's required to interface with people that's remote working is actually greater. You need to be mindful that you need to keep in contact with them more. We're not talking about the eye of sorrow constantly sweeping over people. It's those check-ins. It's not as easy. It's not as easy as, you know, you stand by the coffee machine. You can sort of pick up the nuances. Is somebody all right? Are they not all right? So it does take quite a lot of work. It's also the cultural shift as well. So if we start talking about hybrid models, you know, what are we going to do when we bring people into the office? You know, office space is going to be more sacred. How are we going to use that time? How are we going to get some people that are remote, some people that might be office-based, or, you know, we've got interchangeable teams. How are we going to maximise that? How are we going to get people to collaborate together? So there is a huge upskilling. There's also potentially the upskilling in terms of digitisation and technology. This is picking up on what you were saying, Sarah, as a part of that McKinsey report. There's a distinct shift now. The pandemic has created a distinct shift in terms of automation of roles and digitisation. So there is a major upskilling piece there, because
I mean, in fact, whilst you're addressing that, Paul, we've had another question from Diana. She said, on a similar but different point, what if due to COVID or furlough, there's been some subsequent redundancies and people still in the business now have to change their workloads and responsibilities? Is the employer, or does the employer have a duty to revisit the jobs and the remuneration that those people receive for those jobs? Is that all part of this revisiting what the workplace looks like going forward?
So you have to look at it on a case-by-case scenario, and I'm not trying to cop out on that. What do you require from roles moving forward? You may need to adjust the remuneration, because very similar incidentally what happened in the financial crash, 2008. There were a lot of people, actually, their roles stretched, their skills stretched, and just be mindful of that, because, you know, let's not assume that, you know, because it's really dire at the moment from an economic perspective, that good talent won't move. Because people can.
Yeah. I mean,
and more easily potentially as well, Paul, right?
You're absolutely right, Sarah, because when you look at, you know, the benefits of hybrid working, it's much more easier for talent to move around. It's not restricted to a specific area. Now, look, you may require people, and quite rightly so, when we're talking about hybrid models, to visit a hub. Now, that may be once a month, it may be once a week. It will depend on the organisation. But, you know, the fluidity of talent potentially is going to be something that employers really need to concentrate on. Sorry, Chris.
And this is an interesting question. And maybe another one for you, Paul, actually from Kerry. When a firm has found that people are more productive or productivity levels and output have increased while people have been remote working, is there a requirement for the employer to require his employees to come back to work? And is there an obligation for them to discuss flexible working with their employees?
So, look, it goes back to the issue is that, and Christine, please correct me on this if you think differently. It's been an emergency. It's been a pandemic. It's been a year. So I would say a year is probably not going to bite on custom and practice. I'd say, Christine, please, pitch in on that. But when we reset after this, what does the employer need for their business? I mean, that's the reality of it. What do they need? So they could ask the employee to come back. Employees could equally apply for flexible working. But let's just be mindful that the world has changed. Employees can go off and work for other employers. So there's a really, really fine balance, And just one thing that I think is worth adding is that the way that you monitor performance in terms of hybrid models is more output driven. You can't be there to just consider presenteeism. It's and the skills that are required to manage that can be quite different. The design mechanisms that need to go into the performance management systems can be quite different. That has a knock on to the whole reward piece as well. So, I think if I was to just give an overarching view on that, it's not one size fits all. You've got to look at the individuals. You've got to look at what the organisations absolutely need to operate in a world post-COVID.
Thank you, Paul. Now, I'm conscious of time. We've got a number of questions that have come through on the chat, and I apologise. We won't be able to deal with all of them today verbally, but as Julia said right at the beginning, we're happy to deal with all of those queries. We'll prepare a note which addresses all those questions that have been raised on chat, so you will get a response, don't worry. I have one last question which I think is important, and it's from a different angle. So if I may, Christine, I might just ask you as our final closing point and consideration for the audience. Hybrid models, they sound all well and good, and something that probably every organisation needs to consider to see whether it fits and needs their business and their employee requirements. But during my reading, and obviously of concern to me, is that some hybrid models have inbuilt inclusion problems, not just about around gender, but also around ethnicity, because there's enormous socioeconomic and racial inequality between those who currently work at home and those who may work at home going forward. And for me, there is an obvious concern about opportunities within the workplace, to date, being decided on presenteeism rather than delivery. And I wonder what your view is of that. Is that something that we also need to be mindful of when we're looking at embarking on the route for a hybrid model or longer term remote working?
Yes, I mean, I said a short while ago that working from home should be a choice and not a requirement. You talked about some type of inequality or discrimination perhaps inbuilt there somehow inadvertently. I mean, we know that black and ethnic minorities have been disproportionately affected by COVID, and we know statistics show that black and ethnic minorities tend to live in more crowded accommodation. I mean, I think the statistics are 2% of white people live in overcrowded conditions, and 25% of Bangladeshis live in overcrowded conditions, 18% Pakistanis and 16% blacks. So if we're talking about working from home, and these ethnic minorities are living in crowded conditions and overcrowded conditions, then clearly it would seem to me that working from home would definitely not be seen as suitable or something that was beneficial to those individuals. They were already living in, conditions which probably don't sound to be that favourable, and then if they were required to work from home, then potentially it's not going to be that great for them. So I think what I was saying earlier was that it's a choice. It should be a choice and not a requirement. And employers do need to consult with their employees as to what will work, not just for the business, but for the employees as well. I mean, as Paul was saying, it's not just working from home, it's hubs and, you know, maybe cafes or whatever, or dropping in now and again. So it's just that things need to be taken into consideration. Other factors, other personal factors do need to be taken into consideration as well.
Paul, as a closing comment, do you have anything else that you'd like to raise this afternoon for the audience?
Yes, I do actually, in terms of what we were just talking about, because there is an element equally of opportunity that could be created. And in fact, I was on a very interesting call yesterday with the university that Green Kite are connected to in terms of developing a very senior leadership program. And we were talking about diversity and inclusion. One of the things that hybrid models will be able to do is to create greater scope for a lot of disabled people that can't necessarily travel very easily into offices to be actually able to work from home. So I think there is an opportunity for employers to explore from that. Quite rightly so.
I mean, that's a real nice positive high to finish on. I'd like to draw this session to a close. As I say, for those of you who've raised questions that we haven't managed to cover off today, apologies, but you will get a written response. As I say, Green Kite will follow up on this webinar today, provide some basic advice to the queries that have been raised. But it seems to me that there are lots of issues, as has always been the case for pandemic-related employee questions and concerns. Each firm is different. There is some element of redesign needed for every firm. So I would urge, if you need help, to give Green Kite a call or speak to your normal advisors before embarking on the wrong path for your firm and your employees. I hope today's been interesting for you. And I look forward to speaking to you all again. Thank you, Christine and Paul, for sharing your very valid comments and viewpoints. And thank you, MGAA, for asking us to run today's session. I'll pass back to you, Julia. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you to, of course, Paul and Christine. I think we've really covered some topics there that have no doubt been in the forefront of people's minds, and it's so good to kick about these queries, these ponderings, and to have those discussed. And I think, you know, I think we all view these not only potentially as from an employer's perspective, but we're all employees. So, you know, whether you're responsible for employing staff, managing staff, the fact is that we are all working for a business. So very, very relevant and really helpful. Thank you for that. And it's interesting that, you know, as the conversation goes on, it does start to make people think about the things that they have questions on. So as you said, we had some questions at the end of that, so we appreciate you answering those post-event. Any supporting materials we will be uploading to our website. We will upload this video to our website also, and onto our MGAA YouTube channel. As I said at the beginning of the webinar, we will be sending out a survey for you to complete to give us your feedback on the webinar and any future topics that you'd like to discuss. So we really do appreciate you completing that. So it just leaves for me to say once again, Green Kite, Sarah, Paul, Christine, thank you very much for your time. And thank you to all of our participants today. It's really good to have you on board. Thanks very much.